Okay, excuse me. Thank you all today for coming here and showing up to this session. I would like to introduce our first speaker who is remote. His name is Mark Stege, and Mark, you may begin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that nice introduction, Emily. My name is Mark Stege. I'm working right now as a councilman for the Maloelap Atoll local government. Doesn't pay very well, being a small atoll community, but just enough to buy myself a cup of coffee every day is how I calculated it all. So with my other time, I usually am working as the chief research advisor on atoll habitability thresholds for the Marshall Islands Conservation Society, and I do a little bit of consulting. Nice to be with you all today. So this talk, as it's said in the title just now, is really going to focus on atolls, and specifically atolls in the Pacific. There are quite a few. Usually you hear about Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Maldives in the Indian Ocean. But I'm going to really just key in on the one that I'm most familiar with. This is the Marshall Islands, of course, made up of 29 atolls, but also 5 islets. You can see Maloelap Atoll kind of towards the right there in the Radagayang quadrant. The traditional names for the country could very well have been carried over into our present day, and I think the name of the country would have been Radak. But in any case, the total land area is the size of Washington, D.C., with the across the ocean area 3 times the size of Texas, quite big. So for those who are not familiar with what an atoll looks like, at least underwater, this diagram gives you a good indication. Usually you have this really perfect idea of, a necklace of islands creating this more or less perfect circle, but very few atolls are actually shaped that way. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, these are the 29 plus 5 atolls and islands in the Marshall Islands. Map created by my nephew, Benedict Yamamura. So thanks to those who are producing these wonderful images of atolls. As is often mentioned when describing the Marshall Islands, you'll hear about the nuclear legacy, you'll hear about climate change. Sometimes you'll hear about this large migration trend that's been taking place over the last 2 or so decades. That has really driven some of the research into migration and climate-induced migration specifically, as was the case here in some research that I was actually part of with the University of Hawaii Environmental Law Program, funded by PCASI, and I was based out of the Marshall Islands Conservation Society. Some funding, thankfully, from the Universalist Unitarian Services Committee as well. But this is just meant to give you a sense of, the work that's being done in this field, in this country. And the key findings from this was that, of course, further research is needed, but also that there was no indication from the people that we interviewed that climate change was a driver of their migration decisions or future migration decisions. And also that people are experiencing climate impacts, and that there are some potentially statistically significant relationships between climate indicators and migration decisions. But again, further research is needed. And another finding that I thought was nice to share today was derived from the Q study, which some of you might be familiar with that qualitative and quantitative approach to social sciences. So we were able to delineate three basic or three common themes amongst our respondents to the survey, the Q study, and they're shown here in order of predominance. Almost half were pretty much saying that they don't want to migrate, and they're satisfied with the quality of life in the Marshalls. They do worry, however, about the future of the islands. And a little over a quarter said that more optimistically that they would probably be interested in migration as part of a solution to climate change impacts, but that this would have on their culture. And then there's the island pessimists who are generally dissatisfied with life here and questioning, of course, the future habitability of the islands, and they just see climate change as, you know, leading to a migration that they would fully embrace. So this was an interesting outcome of that study. But in any case, when further research does take place, and this is really the gist of my talk today, I would like to see that knowledge co-production and active monitoring of the thresholds be instilled in that further research to help with some of the internal migration responses. And I really, you know, I'm carefully wording some of this about, you know, internal migration responses to be sensitive to my fellow countrymen and other atoll countries who really reject this idea of migration as a response to climate change. But in doing further research with knowledge co-production, I'm really kind of optimistic that that migration would be well planned, self-determined, done in an orderly way, and it would be done by the migrants themselves. And this would give them, and done in a way that gives them time to maybe shift in their thinking around, you know, the necessity of migration, given the really overwhelming science that's coming out and suggesting that, yeah, migration is going to have to be a part of the solution. So kind of, you know, reframing some of the and bringing into a single approach some of the thoughts that my countrymen have about this question of climate-induced migration. I would say it this way, that we strongly resist the idea of ours becoming uninhabitable, and we would not want to be forced to leave in the future. We feel, in fact, that there are solutions to stay here and to make our islands more habitable. And in some forms, maybe human mobility, but definitely not abandoning our islands, can be part of that solution regime. And so I would say that knowing when managed retreat should be a response to climate change does require understanding more about the atoll habitability thresholds in terms of their locality and their timing, at which we would be unable to adapt in place on our islands, and maybe again employ some internal migration solutions. So I'm just gonna take a moment here and have a drink. Excuse me. So there's going to be a set of slides here that are, very intense and look like this. I'll try to just kind of rush through them a little bit and get to the end of where I really want to spend some time. But essentially, habitability thresholds is needed, and it's been recognized for some time now as being needed by different members, including that fourth bullet point there. That's actually from a letter that the late Tony de Broom wrote to the Department of Interior, Department of Insular Affairs, requesting some assistance on being able to measure and monitor some of these tipping points. And co-production of habitability thresholds really is supported by the literature, suggests that research derived from such methods can achieve both scientifically and politically favorable results. As Kathy Chithingle-Kitchener eloquently put it, co-producing knowledge, take us along on your ride. We won't slow you down. We'll help you win the most important race of all, the race to save humanity. And this really underscores, and is supported by a lot of the literature out there from, much broader parts of the Pacific, including Taiwan and into Canada. Actually, that's insular parts of Canada, I should say. But the first two bullet points, specifically in the Marshall Islands, and that second one I'll highlight really quickly on this next slide. But so these are just some of the thoughts that are coming out of this literature. Won't spend too much time on that, but again, that second bullet regarding one of the atolls here in the Marshalls underlined 4 principal reasons why co-producing knowledge was essential in migration planning, especially in atoll countries. And the first is that the failure to co-produce knowledge is likely to lead to false expectations and a legacy of mistrust, not only in the solutions, but in the science itself. Secondly, the people who live in the atolls have quite a bit of knowledge, and ignoring this knowledge would be to the detriment of the science, especially in terms of conducting some of the logistical work that needs to be done in these remote places. Thirdly, co-production helps ensure the solutions are being developed are actually feasible in the local context, with different ways of land tenure systems and customs and beliefs associated with lands and seas. And lastly, co-producing knowledge can catalyze investment from many of the local actors, even here in the Marshall Islands and other parts of the atoll countries. So putting this theory into practice, putting co-producing knowledge for atoll habitability thresholds research, I would propose that the existent Jaimlyn framework, which is indigenous to the Marshall Islands, is ideally suited for that purpose. And I'll be talking about that now. So in some of the work that I've been doing that I mentioned earlier at the Marshall Islands Conservation Society and with support from others, has been really focused on these 2 areas of thresholds research in atoll countries. One is in flood risk and the other in water security. So a team on the left is actually conducting is collecting spot elevations along a transect in Maloelap Atoll and producing a flood map that the community later used to review and to validate and to understand better what the future might hold, but also to improve upon the model itself. And on the right, Nikki here worked with me in a community here on Madro Atoll, the capital island, in the community of Laura, where he's from. And he was, you can see in his left hand, a salinity meter, and in his right hand, a 10-meter long extension to lower down the sensor down into the groundwater. And he's taking some salinity readings of the groundwater in his community. These baselines of information will actually help in many ways. And in many cases, the work has just started, but setting down some baselines is really essential to good science, as many of you know. So that's been kind of the catalyst for a lot of this, or at least the framework around which my work can follow and build into other people's work here in the country and around the region. So what is the Maloelap? It's the implementation mechanism for resource managers who are implementing resource management plans in the country, developing them for the purpose of effectively conserving at least 50% of marine resources and 30% of terrestrial resources by 2030. And this is being done, the Micronesia Challenge, that is being done alongside other Micronesian states and Commonwealth and territories that are listed there. The picture on the far left is actually a team called the Coastal Management Advisory Council. That's not all of them, but they're the ones who are kind of facilitating the Maloelap at the local level. And here is the Maloelap itself is a 8-step process, very common across the world, I think. You initiate a project, you build commitment for its objectives, you collect and manage information, then you develop a kind of a plan around that to address what are the risks identified, and then you get the community to kind of codify it into their local governance system or sign off. And then you just monitor and evaluate, and you adapt the plan as you go forward. So this is happening, and the way it's happening is it's been happening for the last maybe 20 years now in the Marshalls, and as you can see, quite a few of the atolls have benefited so far. And here again is that same picture. Everything just kind of resized so that you can see it a little bit better. So the 8 steps, step 4 is really where much of the data is gathered. And this is where co-production of knowledge is most viable and available. To conserve the marine and terrestrial habitats in this part of the world, a lot of surveys are conducted, and then the outcomes of those surveys are produced into knowledge that turn into step 5 policies and plans, or resource management plans. That just kind of gives you a sense of that process, of the 8-step process, specifically with the work on atoll habitability thresholds. Flood mapping tends to be kind of the first order of data that we need to look at. And so step 4, island height flood risk assessments are conducted, and there are 5 basic data inputs to do that flood map listed here. I'm going to be talking mostly about that last one, the historic vegetation line comparison, due to time limitations. Just wanted to add that last bullet point, that creating these maps provides an opportunity, of course, for co-producing knowledge. And yes, I'll be focused on that. So the historic vegetation line comparison is also more commonly known and through a process developed by the Woods Hole, Massachusetts, called Digital Shoreline Change Analysis, or DSAS. DSAS, I should say. Digital Shoreline Analysis Systems. Apologies for that. But in any case, shoreline change analysis can be more effectively done when co-produced with long-term residents of that shoreline, I would propose, and facilitated by geospatial technicians like those in the CMAC group. So previous studies that you may have heard about have suggested that there's a trend of shoreline accretion across atolls. And so there's this idea that maybe the atolls are actually grown and can keep pace with level rise. But it's interesting that the shoreline change analysis conducted really didn't capture the big, some critical elements, such as an airport construction project that was conducted during the time of analysis. And so the island shoreline changes were characterized as a trend of shoreline accretion. But as you can see on the pictures there, a lot of the islands, a lot of the channels in between islands on an atoll, this one is Majuro specifically, were actually infilled to create a continuous 30-mile stretch of land that you can now visit here in Majuro. But there used to be actually more than 10 islands, and so they connected these islands in the 1960s, and then after that they built the airport. And so the analysis that was conducted suggests something that's completely different than what actually should have been the insight gained and the findings from that analysis. So this could happen in many other instances in the Marshalls, since there are so many atolls, and I think future digital shoreline change analysis would be really good to be done in a co-produced manner. And furthermore, not just the digital shoreline change analysis, but compiling other data sets, like on the far left, the women on Medjugorje Island went about with the geotagging different food trees on their island, and identified breadfruit, which is the one in green, taro, a little bit, it's off the screen, pandanus in red, bananas, papayas, limes, and what we call apple trees in this part of the world. Not actually apples, but in any case, that layer of information about the food trees on Medjugorje Island, I think, would be very interesting to layer onto a flood risk assessment for the atoll. And an actual flood that took place on January the 21st of 2015 was mapped, as you can see in the image in the middle, and it covered part of the airport. And there was photo evidence, and of course the people witnessed everything, so we could validate what we saw in the map that they produced. So just pulling all this information together would be just so rich and enriching to the flood risk assessment of Medjugorje Island, if it were done this way, alongside the digital shoreline change analysis. So some implications for managed retreat, and this is the final slide. Co-determinations on what data sets to gather and how to gather them and how to analyze them. Essentially, co-determining research design can reveal that there are existing frameworks and mechanisms and data that may already exist in some cases that would be really helpful for managed retreat research and policy development. For example, in the Marshalls, the Remalak approach. Another implication, I would say, is that research co-produced by in situ and ex situ actors must build in enough time. It does take a little bit more time, and as well the appropriate conditions for joint iterative reflection. And lastly, controversial but necessary decisions, such as manage retreat. And in the Marshall Islands, because of the land tenure system here, another controversial decision would be land use zoning regulations. These decisions, however controversial, can be made in a more compelling and culturally sensitive way through co-production of knowledge. Well, thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions that may come up at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And now I'd like to present to the next speaker, Jaimlyn Sypniewski.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here and listening to my talk. My name is Jaimlyn Sypniewski. I'm a PhD student out of Oregon State University, and I'd like to share with you some of the research I'm doing and working with the Alaska Indigenous tribes and trying to do, as was previously suggested, incorporate traditional knowledge to enable more of a culturally sensitive retreat. So we're going to be starting off with the Alaska Native village of Newtok. There's about 200 individuals in this village, and they are currently experiencing erosion rates of up to 300 feet a year. So going back to this original image, this photo is only 5 years old. And as you can see, the river has already started to create some erosion with some of those houses just being on the brink. Well, just 5 years later, the erosion is actually all the way back to behind the large blue building you see in the middle in 5 years. Their village is disappearing and is projected to be entirely eroded within the next 20 years. So they were heralded as one of the first climate migrants of the US, and there was extensive research done into how to properly move one community to a safer location, seeing as a lot of the surrounding areas is on these delta and permafrost ponds, and there was no option for an inland retreat. However, after we successfully created the village of Muktavik, infrastructure was put in place on a very stable basalt outcropping that would be stable against erosion, just slightly inland so that it was safe from storm surge and sea level rise. The villagers started moving over, and I reached out and I contacted one of them and I asked them what it felt like to now be in a safe location, to not have to worry about the next storm or worry about whether you're going to be eroded, only to be told that they are moving to Anchorage. They had spent some time in the new village, and they had decided at that point that they wanted to voluntarily move to Anchorage instead of being in this new community that was developed specifically to keep them from having to go to Anchorage. And I asked why? Why would you choose to migrate now? And especially given all of the work that's gone into it. And I was told quite simply that they are not able to maintain their traditional practices in this new village. They are on a very sturdy basalt outcropping, but it does not allow for cemeteries. They are further inland, so they don't have to worry about storms, but they can no longer reach their fish and their salmon. They are only 8 miles from their original site, and their whole village was able to go, but they are on the wrong side of the river, and they are no longer able to access the caribou migration in the area. Given the choice that they are now fully dependent on grocery stores and imported food and can no longer maintain their subsistence lifestyle, which at this point was almost 100%, they might as well, and I quote, have access to a Best Buy. And I wanted to dig further deeper into why. This is an excellent example of the framework that I have seen presented here in this conference, and it does implicitly take into consideration ties to the land. It takes under the environment, food, energy, water security. This is a very comprehensive approach, and I know that the villagers of Newtok were consulted multiple times in this moving process. So why? Why did we not select it? And when talking to these villagers, I think that there was an assumption that if it was close enough, it was just down the road, that any of their traditional practices that could have been practiced could still be practiced only a short 8 miles away. And one of the reasons that I think that this wasn't brought to the forefront of this relocation was the inability to actively map this traditional knowledge and these traditional practices in a validated and standardized method. And which is increasingly complicated because it will vary on such a site-to-site basis. How do you map something when the hazards themselves are complicated, when it could be drought in the Southwest or wildfires, the erosion that I talked about, or the high temperatures presented in the interior? How can you even get at a method for incorporating all of this traditional knowledge that'll vary so vastly in space? Which is the question I'm actually seeking to answer in my research. And one of the first things I want to do is I want to talk to the villagers. I want to put aside my scientific hat and just understand what they've seen and what they've learned and the ways that they are currently managing their resources, the ways that they are currently practicing their traditions. And I'm trying to get at the climate drivers behind those traditional practices. So in the event of New Talk, a climate driver would just be access to caribou migration. We can, with relative certainty, many of us can map caribou migrations. That's a data set we have access to. Basalt rock and whether or not it's suitable for a cemetery is data that we have access to. So understanding which of these implicit climate drivers directly affects traditional practices, I was hoping to find a way to start modeling areas that can sustain these practices going forward. So the place that I chose to study was Ketchikan, Alaska, primarily because I knew individuals in Ketchikan, Alaska that were experiencing concerns and they were supportive. The first thing I did is I wanted to know if it was just my friends that were supportive or the village. And so I reached in and I asked if this was type of research and knowledge that would be useful to the village themselves. And I received an overwhelmingly positive response. So much so I was invited out on some of their cultural excursions and I was able to just spend days listening and hearing and watching what they knew and what they were experiencing. And from doing so, I was just astounded by the amount of knowledge that they implicitly had, such as when they have warmer springs, they know that they're going to be able to get 2 seaweed harvests that year. However, they realize that it's also going to come with a little bit of a detriment to their mussels habitat, as warm waters tend to result in algal blooms and parasitic shellfish poisoning. So they realize that with a single one, there are trade-offs, and that's knowledge that they implicitly have. Additionally, they are also able to draw your eyes to patterns in the climate data that you might not have been aware of or that I wasn't aware of. For example, the precipitation is not anticipated to change much in Ketchikan, and it hasn't. On average, they receive approximately the same amount of precipitation. However, one of the greatest concerns of the villagers is the droughts that they are experiencing. And they were pulled to this by the fact that they rely solely on rain catchments for their fresh water supply. And they've been getting their rain in very destructive flood events where it comes in precipitation all over a few days, maxes out their rain catchments. And then by the time the next rain event happens, they're having to import water as they are experiencing an almost total drought. We do this with some community-led observation data. So the villagers that I have worked with are already participating in a photo voice observation method. They are documenting what they have seen. They are taking photos, they are writing it down, they are videotaping it, recording it, and incorporating it in their stories. So they want their knowledge to be used. They want to be able to do something useful with all of these trends that they're seeing. And so given the overwhelming amount of knowledge they have, how can you feasibly couple it with some of the climate drivers that we currently have? And in doing so, it's sort of a 3-step approach. So you create, the first step is, and that's done separately and essentially at the same time, is the creation of the climate variables. I want to understand the climate variables that are driving the suitability of these traditional practices. So the first step was the development of a very robust data set that is separate entirely from the traditional knowledge. And then coming in at a very bottoms-up approach of the participatory mapping and talking to the villagers to understand their knowledge. In the end, I have these two incredibly robust data sets, and therein comes when I'm going to couple them by using some deep learning methods to use the traditional knowledge of some of the driving variables. So just quickly going to go over some of those methods. Step one, climate-based analysis, using some of the climate data generated by the IPCCs, some historical observations, and a reanalysis of the era, it is the era 4 data set that was just released. We are able to create slow and extreme climate indices. So number of hot days, number of cold days, when does precipitation change from snow to rain? We are able to suss out very downscaled, nuanced climate variable data. Then holding that data and setting it aside for the moment, we then come in to the village level participatory mapping. And it is here where I'm trying to assess what they need to sustain their traditional practices. And those traditional practices will actually vary from site to site. So hunting, harvesting, food processing and preparation, whether it's rain catchments, ice cellars, these things will vary from village to village, but I'm hoping the methods that are used to implement this decision can be used on various villages. So one of the ways that we have been gathering this data is to do mapping, where I just bring in a laminated map and some Sharpies, and they tell me which areas are currently able to support their traditional practices and why. Furthermore, we go on to detailed interviews where I just listen and I hear their concerns. I don't come in and tell them what their problems are. I listen to what they've seen and what they're continuing to see. And then further, to increase the data set, there's also going to be some significant surveys throughout the villages. We're hoping that this will help create a very nuanced data set of the local knowledge. And this is Irene, and she was telling me a story about how she used to be able to preserve her salmon by hanging it up to dry. And due to these droughts, there's an influx of dust and flies, and she no longer can practice that traditional method due to these environmental concerns. And so what we're hoping to gather from this data set is exactly that. What are the driving variables that are causing you to change your traditional ways? And then here comes the technique. So I'm hoping to use methods that have already been established for species distribution models, which is where you apply, has a species occurred there before? What does a species need to live? Does it have temperature restraints? Does it have thresholds? Can it only move in a certain area? And you're able to determine whether or not that particular bird might roost in the area. But I am taking those methods and I'm actually applying them to the traditional practices. Have the practices existed before? What environmental drivers did those practices need to exist? And I'm hoping to model not only the areas where traditional practices could be applied today, but also how those areas might shift in the future, or locations that might be able to support these traditional practices if villages are forced to make the decision to relocate. Could I possibly predict a way where they could relocate to areas and still maintain their traditional lifestyles? So in conclusion, I don't want to not look at the hazards. I don't want to not look at the political pull and push that goes into mitigation planning, but I am hoping to add a layer to all of the data sets that are out there that maybe can help encompass and physically map areas that are sustainable for the traditional practices, allowing a more wholesome life for those that are forced to migrate.
Thank you, Jaimlyn. And now I would like to present our online speaker, who is Giovanna Gini. So if you would like to share your screen, we could see you.
Perfect, thank you. We'll try to share it. Okay, you should be able to see it now.
Yes, we do.
Can you see also, can you see just the slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so good evening, I think, afternoon. I'm from London. I mean, no, from London, but I'm in London, so there's this slightly different of time. So I'm Giovanna Gini. I just finished my PhD actually in February. And now I'm more doing some consultancy work with different projects. So, but basically what I'm going to present today is part of my PhD thesis, and hopefully will carry on to be my research in a postdoc. So this paper explores the temporalities of forced relocation due to climate change. I specifically examined the mobility of Enseada da Baleia, which is a small Islander fishing community of the south coast of Brazil that was forced to relocate in 2016 due to coastal erosion and sea level rise and frequent storm, etc. This paper emerged from feminist and decolonial approaches in 8 months of ethnographic work. I will explore how, and basically what I do is explore how Enseada's relocation occur within a thick temporality, incorporating the past and the future in the present to enable the community to withstand the impacts of climate change. However, as a follow-up from that, I would like to interrogate, and perhaps I don't have the answers, but I would like to keep exploring this. What are the politics of this idea of thick temporalities? What does it mean to the politics of climate change and relocation or retreat or managed retreat, and what we can learn from it? So first, just the outline of the presentation. I will locate the island. I will locate the community geographically, and show a little bit of their house. Then I will just explain what I think or what I understand by thick temporalities, and then I will speak about the materiality of these temporalities in the land and the making of the place, the floor of a house, the orchards and plants, and then the coming back of the dry fish, a practice that is also traditional for these communities, and then the conclusion, obviously. So just as like the drawings is part of my methodology. Some of the drawings are mine, some of the drawings are from the same community, and other drawings are from a friend of mine and the community that is an illustrator. So the Cardoso Island is the house of Enseada, is home of Enseada. Which is in the southeast coast of Brazil, and is between the borders of 2 states, São Paulo and Paraná. Is home of several Caiçara communities that have been in that island for more than 200 years. The island, though, became a conservation park in 1972, and that is important for many reasons that I will explain after. And basically, the island broke in 2 in 2018 due to the process I already mentioned, and it broke in the exactly place where the community was located. And you can see in the graphic where was the old, where is the new. This is again where was the new, and was where this is where the old Enseada was located, and then this is where the new Enseada is now. The relocation of the community was self-managed. That means that they didn't have any sort of help or any sort of authority or government of institution. It was the community who pushed for it and realized by their own and with the support of friends, and did it by the own and the support of friends. The relocation required that even a legal fight for the right to relocate inside the island, because it's a conservation park. And basically, the new location is only 5 kilometers from the old one, meaning that they are still at risk of a future relocation again, because of the process of erosion is still ongoing and is becoming worse with the increase of frequent storm and extreme weather events. This again more picture of the island, how it looks like. This was before the breaking of the island. This was the location of the old Enseada. And this is a new curve that is becoming smaller and probably will break in the future. Yeah, this is after the breaking of the island. This is where the community used to be. And this is a map made by the community of the new community, of the new place. Just to illustrate how the house look, how the community looks like. So the theoretical framework, before going to the analysis, I will just explain what I mean by transcorporality, what I mean for thick temporalities. I'm sorry, I don't know how to stop that thing to happen. The moving of the slide. Maybe there, no. Anyways, so I'm arguing that the temporalities of Enseada happens is embedded in thick temporalities. According to Neymas and Walker, thick time or temporalities refer to a transcorporeal stretching between present, future, and past. In other words, the past is never left behind. The past is never left behind, never finished once and for all, and the future is not unfolding in the present, but rather the past and the future are enfolded participants in matters interactive becoming, if that makes sense. I hope that will make sense in a bit. What I understand by what it means transcorporality. So it's the idea that humans, people, and the environment, but also like environment not as a tree or plant, but also some non-human agents like plants, fish, etc., are inseparable. They one form the other, creating a singular unit of many pieces, if that makes sense. All of them alive and mobile in different times. So as a fair aspect, and I hope that at the end this will make more sense, this theoretical sort of framework while I'm explaining the different aspects. So as a fair aspect to explore this thick transcorporeal temporalities, I present the land selected for the new Enseada. So the oldest grandma of the community, the name was Ersi, choose the location for the new Enseada, for the new community. For Ersi, that place seemed ideal geographically because it had all the requirements to maintaining traditional activities and generate sustainable income. Ersi knew this place personally because during her youth, she used to spend the day there making food for the men who went fishing. That was a meeting point, a meeting place for people. The place was abandoned with the years because of the out-migration from the island, in part due to the policies of conservation imposed by the establishment of the park in 1962. The intimacy of the relocation temporalities emerge in this choosing of the land. There is a personal connection between the new location and the past of the community. Ersi, the grandma, transmitted her memories of experience that place to her children and grandchildren. She ate fruit from those trees. While eating, I imagine some seeds might have fallen into the ground and grow into mature trees. I saw this happening all the time in the village, in the community, which make it normal to find an orange tree near a house or a watermelon plant. The lands remember and give back the fruit of transcorporeal collaboration and cohabitation. Transcorporality reveals the interchanges and interconnection between humans' corporality and fleshiness and the more than human, the not-human agents, right? Transcorporality denies the splitting of subject and object. The subject, the knower, is never separate from the world that she seeks to know. As such, the relocation through the transcorporeal experience of Ersi and is embedded in thick time, shows a profound intimacy in this process. As such, the past is never left behind, never finished when unspored, and the future is not unfolding, as I said before. The second part, the second aspect that I will present is the floor of the big house. This is the only picture I found from the floor of this house, and it's this kind of teach a lesson of how to manage data after fieldwork. Always keep it like tidy and in folders. If not, you will lose it. So the inhabitants of Enseada, in this picture that we're showing this map is of the old Enseada. As you can see, the boards of the floor that is around the map are the different colors, and they seem used and old. This is because these were boards that used to be part of all houses or of the houses of the old Enseada. Good from the old houses is repurposed to make the floor of the big house. They would look beautiful together, every piece a different color, texture, and size. The floor brings memory, and the people can still remember which part was from what house. The floor materialized this transcorporeal temporality, highlighting that everything has a trace, an echo, a past that is still resonant in the present. They have a quite symbolic power. The big house, as I name it, is the biggest house in Enseada, and the home where the meetings about the community, about the projects and the strategies take place. It is the first house that you can see when you arrive to the village, and because it's big and beautiful, it stays with you, literally. The sediments of the principal houses of Enseada are the boards of the old houses, all together making a strong and reliable base to build a future. The orientation towards the past suggests Enseada's approach to pursuing self-determination. Transcorporeal experiences offer connection across time and space to their identity and reveals a new understanding of place attachment that have to do more, instead of attachment to things, have to do more with relationship and less with the static things. Now I will speak about the plans. The new location brought back activities and sites that were compromised by the entry of salty water in the old place now, because sometimes something that came again and again in conversation during fieldwork was the fact that in the previous place, in the old Enseada, the one that was disappearing, the people of Enseada did not have a space anymore, not even for carry on with their traditional activities. Those activities that are part of their history and identity, like agriculture. And this links a little bit with the concept of habitability, or perhaps the non-materiality of habitability. With the relocation, they are going back to the past by recovering traditional activities too. For example, due to the newly gained space, every house has its orch again, which allows the community to carry on with their independency and be in touch with their agricultural heritage. However, the orch have been suspended away from the floor, protecting the plants from the future that comes rolling in with every new high tide. In other words, protecting the plants from frequent floods that predict an undeniable future, one of sea invading their new home and the call of a new and future relocation. With the orch, the inhabitants of Enseada went back to their past. Movement here is expressed in exchanges and interconnections between humans, corporality, and not humans, the plants. By this interaction, Enseada engage and create a different sense of place and being. They create home and themselves in this process, no? Transcorporality orients time. In other words, experiences, sensations, sympathy, and affect shape how the past move into the present and the future. Such transcorporeal temporality reflects that there is not a singular unfolding of time. The specific path to the past or future give rise to a unique experience and the process of becoming, of creating and making themselves, their houses, etc., their home. Finally, I will speak about the coming back of the dry fish practice. I argue because the dry fish practice finished before the relocation for several reasons and came back after the relocation. I argue that Enseada's engagement with fish is not only about going back to the past to face the future, but also a process of partial healing after the relocation. Here I understand a relocation as violent, generating trauma and losses. Therefore, partial healing is what Donna Haraway explained as about recuperation in complete history that are full of dying and living and full of endings, even genocides and beginnings. In the face of climate violence, healing is about modest possibilities of partial recuperation and getting on. Fishing and drying fish are crucial to strengthen the sense of community, continuity, and kinship, and the transmission of knowledge to new generations. I noticed from conversations that drying fish for Enseada is very special, at it brings ties with their elders, with their history and their identities. For example, during the hard work of drying fish, the women speak about their grandparents, Ersi and Malakias. This was their work, their art. Many women learned to salt the fish from Ersi when they were children. Ersi died during the process of relocation, so they remember her every time they work with fish. Not only, but also when they're doing that. They say they're happy. Indeed, they look happy when they're working with the fish, even if it's very hard and it's not very pleasant, the conditions. Drying fish is a way of coming back to their identity, to what makes Enseada and carry on with their ancestral heritage. Drying fish is an intimate, a collective moment, raising awareness of the self and the other, but also of the togetherness of the community. Bodies of fish and humans intertwine with histories, with history. Temporalities and place create an attachment to way of being in the world, resisting the violence of climate change through relations that shape and make their place and who they are and who they want to be. The histories associated with the fish practice tell the healing and recuperation is found in reinforcing their worlds, their worldviews, their encounters, their relationship and kinship, and their tradition of adapting to a changing environment. In this context, resistance also involves staying as a community, as a community together and carry on even after the forced relocation. So the past is never left behind. It carries on. This is the conclusion. Bringing the future into the present. The temporalities of the relocation is thick. Temporalities in the relocation are in a visible disorder, challenging the linear Western conception of the past, present, and the future. With the breaking of the island, which put in motion the preventive and forced relocation, Enseada went back into Earth's past, returning to Earth's past, show how transcorporeal experience of place make the relocation or a relocation an intimate process. Transcorporality also put in evidence continuity between the old and the new community or the new Enseada. This continuity also speaks about how to go forward in the new location and perhaps in the future relocation as well. It is evident that the indigenous world does not conceive history as linear. The past and future is contained in the present. The regression or progression, the repetition or overcoming of the past is at play in each conjuncture and depending on practice and relations. Politically, the thick temporalities of the relocation could help us link ideas of modernity and capitalist inventions of movement as either upwards or onwards. A Western conception produces material consequences. For example, on narrative security, the future yet to come of racialized movement around climate change scenarios. By looking at thick time or thick temporalities, we are able to liberate movement from an almost imposed duration, such as the movement from the south to the north or to the rural to the urban. In this way, we take distance from this matrix of progress and this idea of accumulation that informs the creation of borders as obstacles to movement. This has implication for the way we interpret conventional vertical hierarchies in relation to movement, including the assumptions that we can only move forward to somewhere from south to north, from the past to the future, from nature to industry, from backward to modern. Emancipation movement from linear time and direction make us think beyond that and encourage to rediscover these relations that make movement go horizontally and even circularly. This exploration requires engagement with silence and invisibilized way of knowing, sensing and being and thinking that exists in the indigenous traditions, and that require this collaborative and co-authored, co-produced knowledge. So yeah, that was the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Giovanna. And now I'd like to present our last speaker, Tess Stoffinger.
Hi, Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all today. My name is Tess Steffinger, and I am currently a postdoc based at the University of Delaware. And today I'm going to be talking about coastal adaptation pathways, and I've been doing a case study in Folly Beach, South Carolina. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the method that I'm trying to work up and then get into the case study. And I know this is the last one for the day, so I'll try to keep it quick. So kind of the background and aims for this, I am coming from a quantitative background, and I've worked some in decision-making and uncertainty. And a lot of the talk in that sphere is really around pathways of change and pathways moving forward. And kind of the first step of that is to know the historical and cultural context of the area. All these studies mention it, yet they're not really clear on how to do that, or the information, that qualitative information, how that can be put into the decision-making process. So that's kind of, I saw a gap there, and that's really what I was trying to fill with this research. So yeah, thinking of looking at historic pathways, some of the things or the types of information that we could get from this analysis and carry on into decision-making for the future, there's like 5 things here that I've identified. One of the most basic is really just that added historical context, but also trying to start to identify triggers of change. So what's really driving these communities to do managed retreat, to do beach nourishment, to make these kinds of decisions? And then what are the causal mechanisms at play too? Is it the political will? Is it state or national funding? What is kind of causing or the process that these decisions are being made under? Also, path dependency is very important. How ingrained are some of these historic pathways? It's important to know that. So when people, come in to suggest different investments for the future, they kind of already know what's there. And finally, this need to connect the past to the present and then the future to make better decisions. So and the whole goal of this project was kind of develop a replicable method to look at historical pathways. All right, so just a few definitions to start. These are by no means official. This is just to give you an idea of kind of where I'm coming from with this research. So one of the key ones there is just the adaptation actions. And the way that I am thinking about that is in terms of investments in infrastructure, institutions, and information. So that's kind of how I split that up. Triggers are pretty easy to understand. That was kind of the cause or the initiation of an adaptation. The causal mechanism is kind of that process that links the trigger to the action. And adaptation pathways we see as sequencing or the sequence of adaptation actions through time. And then again, path dependence is just kind of how ingrained that pathway is in a community. And there have been some studies looking at historical pathways of adaptation. There's kind of 7 key ones that I looked at, and they all kind of focus on that trigger, the adaptation, and path dependency. And the typical methods that have been used are interviews, surveys, document literature review, a lot of the qualitative based methods, and really the timeline synthesis, they all kind of include that as well, trying to link those pathways through a timeline. So that's kind of what's out there, but none of these really kind of give you a replicable method of how to conduct this if we want to start doing case studies to do a comparative analysis. So that was kind of the plan here. So here's the proposed approach that we have. So kind of just starting with the initial interviews and literature review, taking that information, putting it on a timeline, and then trying to connect the dots between the triggers and the actual actions. And then going back through, it's a very iterative process, trying to identify those pathways. And when we kind of put all of that on the timeline to begin with, what we were really looking for at the beginning was just those triggers and then the adaptation actions. Okay, I'll get into the case study really quick. So I looked at Folly Beach, South Carolina. That picture, I guess on your left, was after Ian and Nicole. That was taken in December. So they lost about a foot of beach just after those 2 storms. And I didn't put a picture on there from last week. I think they're almost down 4 feet just in erosion. So it's pretty crazy what's going on down there. And this was an example of a king tide just a couple weeks ago. So it's a small barrier island about 10 miles from downtown Charleston, South Carolina, and which makes it a very popular local destination as well as tourists coming in from out of state. It is a relatively wealthy community, and about half of the residents are seasonal. And for this research, I started with about 18 different interviews, interviewing local officials, state officials, people with the Sea Grant, the Nature Conservancy, and the Army Corps. And then also doing that literature review, looking at meeting minutes, ordinances, just trying to see what's going on in terms of those triggers and adaptations. And this is essentially the key things that I was looking for. We did kind of include some things at that state and national level. So different policies that may trickle down and affect the local. So we looked at those and then specific hazards. And these specific hazards are definitely tailored towards Charleston and that area. So mainly looking at storms, king tides, floods. And you would think of these more as like a shock event instead of a slow onset hazard, I guess. And then also looking at the different types of adaptations in terms of institutions, information, and the different infrastructure they're using down there. All right, so I know nobody's going to be able to read this, so I'm going to try to point some stuff out, but this is the timeline that we ended up coming up with. So on the y-axis, these are split between the different investments in infrastructure institutions and also the hazards and different things going on at the other levels of government. And then this just kind of shows through time what's been happening. And it's fun to look too. You can see how the hurricanes have also increased as we go through time. They've had 5 named storms in the past 5 years, so it's a little crazy down there. But the one pathway that I wanted to point out and I want to talk about a little bit today is the beach nourishment going on in Folly. So back in about, I think it was 1896, the Army Corps of Engineers put the Charleston Harbor jetties in, and this has slowly, caused a problem with erosion for the island. And back in the late 1980s, they actually sued the federal government, and that didn't go well for them. So then they pursued a Section 111 with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that took 10 years, but the Army Corps said, yes, we are partially responsible for this erosion problem. We will now provide beach nourishment for you every 10 years for 50 years. So that's one easy pathway from this research that we kind of picked up on. And that's what I wanted to talk about really quick. So some kind of key takeaways from the specific pathway that we have seen. So kind of looking at how the trigger of the installation of the jetties has led to this cycle of renourishment. So one of the easiest things to point out is that this is actually a cyclical pathway because a lot of the times when we think of pathways in the future, we're thinking linearly, but a lot of these pathways, some of these communities on may actually be cyclical in nature. So kind of where in that cycle can we start to break into to make the biggest change? And then, so this was actually a really easy one to identify the trigger and the path because the Army Corps did say they were 85% responsible for their erosion. So that was really nice. But then there's also this little piece here in the yellow. So I love how this is just going on its own. But anyway, so there's this little piece in the middle that's in this yellow box. So how did we get from that trigger to this cycle of renourishment? And that's kind of that causal mechanism that we're wanting to start picking up on. And that's where I'm kind of focused right now. So we've really started to look, like I said, for the triggers and then the adaptations, but what's that link in between? And I'm working with CIDRs on this right now, and we're trying to start using process tracing to kind of pick that up. Just again, here's this little chunk through time where all of this kind of activity happened at that local level, suing the federal government, pursuing the Section 111. So digging like deeper into that to see those causal mechanisms that then led to the nourishment. Again, here, trying to say we want to start using process tracing. That's essentially that part. And then I also just wanted to say quickly as well, I went down there to look at coastal adaptation and specific adaptations happening on the ocean front, but I quickly realized that there's a lot of other things going on in Folly that are important and that impact the actual coastal adaptation. So there's also the marsh side of things where they're seeing those king tides and the flooding, but also development. So a lot of people actually brought up that in 2015, there was a 1,000 year rain event. So this is kind of getting highlighted over here. So that happened in 2015. And several of the people I interviewed mentioned that that actually led to a really big flurry of information gathering. So they did a marshfront management plan. They did a sea level rise adaptation plan. So witnessing that flooding really kind of triggered this need for more information about what's going to be going on in the future. And then there's also several people have mentioned when I was down there, there's also a development pathway that's occurring. So back in the 80s as well, there was a really big push to limit development and high rises in the area. And the local citizens won that. They really wanted to keep their local flavor and keep Fale local. And then just since I've been down there in the last year, there's been another kind of development push away from short-term rentals and trying to limit those, and a lot of advocacy going on in the community. So there's another pathway kind of there going on with development. And I just wanted to say at the end, so really, when we start looking at these adaptation pathways, I think we need to be open to looking at different pathways as well that may emerge through the research. So really, Folly Beach is not just about erosion, but it's about the development and flooding as well, and how those interact through time. Because really, when you think about it on the development side, you know, if a couple members from their city council would leave and they're switched with people that are going to push for more development, that could really change the risk profile of the island, which then could affect the flooding and erosion as well. So yeah, it's been interesting. And just still trying to finalize that method, looking at the process tracing part, trying to identify the causal mechanisms there in the middle, and then hopefully replicating this to other islands around the area. So yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, it'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you to these amazing speakers. And now I'd like to transition to the Q&A section of this session. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. I see one over there. Just hold a minute for the microphone.
Thank you to all the presenters. I really appreciated your efforts and learned a lot. I had a question for Jaimlyn. New Talk has been on my heart for many years, for many reasons. And I've heard people from different Indigenous contexts saying things like people outside the tribe have this kind of snapshot view of what it is to be Indigenous that's sort of rooted in the past. And I was curious to hear, because the migration of species theory, and I'm botching the name and I apologize, I wonder how much it really would reflect for humans in the sense that, you know, humans are becoming also, they're becoming something different. The comment about Best Buy, you know, a lot of people feel that education is the way forward. And I do mean, you know, from Indigenous folks, they want to see their children go to college so anyway, so how does that reflect in choosing a new place? Because it's not only the traditions, I mean, that's super important, but also how they see themselves in the future.
So I can actually, one of the things that really ties them is that education. So there's a very strong push that, so this is actually rather terrible and very outdated. One of the reasons that will affect whether they choose to migrate or not migrate is whether they can be a part of the school system. Because if children are not able to attend a certified school system, then the state will actually take them away and put them into a community that has an approved school. So one of the pushes to migrate is if they lose too much of their family age demographic and too many of their children leave, they don't meet the minimum amount of children required to have a school, which I believe is 10. And a lot of these villages are only 70 people. And then a lot of them have to migrate to ensure that they are with their children when they go to school so they do not lose their children. And I think one of the things that's also taken into consideration in migration is if villages are close enough to one another, they can band together their children to say that they are all attending the same school if it's within a commutable distance. But if one of those villages chooses to relocate, it might have cascading effects because then they won't be able to continue to stay there because their kids will be taken and put into communities that have what they're being told is better education. So I don't know if that was, sorry.
I mean, it's so important for New Talk because they got located there.
You need to get to the mic for the people online cannot.
With New Talk, that's a really important point because the reason that they located there to begin with is because that's where the school was built. And so they were required. That's why they were there in the first not in the first place, but in recent history and recent memory. So yeah, the education is bound up in the story. And I just wondered how it was, I know you're in the middle of the work, but I just feel like that's really important about what people are becoming next.
Oh, I did want to add that there has been a recent surge of young members of the tribal community wanting to get back to their more traditional methods. So a lot of the language has actually been lost, and that's not exclusive to Alaska. We've seen that all over the place where you speak a native tongue, then you're forced not to speak a native tongue and speak English, and then your children only speak English. So that's being seen in the Alaska as well, but there's this huge and inspiring resurgence of getting back to those traditional roots and those traditional practices and starting to be proud of them again and starting to participate in them actively again. It's rather inspiring.
Hi, thank you all. Jaimlyn, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you're bringing in with the algorithmic and mathematical approach, because it sounds like you're doing a very qualitative sort of study that really attends to the unique factors of each tribe and their environment and the different subsistence practices that they engage in. And I'm wondering, are you trying to generalize and create a model to apply to different situations, or I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what you're intending to do with that side of it.
Yeah, so I'm going to be applying a lot of deep learning methods using the drivers identified as the villages. So in a species distribution model, a lot of your drivers are climate based, like you'll have temperature thresholds or days of being wet, certain access to food, and you can actually determine those and use those as their thresholds into the model. So we're going to be using some mixed machine learning methods, including a random forest model that's integrated as well. And we use some of the driving variables that we got from our downscaled climate data sets, which those extreme event indices are going to be incorporated in the surveys and the questions that we ask. After we have a good understanding of what they're looking for, we're not telling them, then we will use that information and connect it to those extreme event indices to determine which ones we should use when we apply this predictive model.
Do you see a use for this beyond the tribal implications? Do you think this could be used for urban and rural communities with resource allocation, community needs identified through surveys and things like that?
Yes, actually, I was having a conversation with some of the people that are doing work down in Louisiana and how this could be applied to some of the different communities in Louisiana that are just as tied. You know, they've been fishermen for generations, they have certain access and certain culture. And I'm really hoping that this method helps to bring a voice to anyone on the forefront of climate change. And it can even be applied. Hopefully the methods will also work in more of an urban environment as well. The village of Ketchikan is actually the largest village in Alaska. So it's considered an urban village, one of the only. So I'm hoping that if it can work there, that it can be scaled in either direction.
Thank you for all the speakers. And I have a question for all of the speakers. When I think all of your research and during your research, you have conducted some interviews with different stakeholders. And I have a question. It's like, what's the most challenging kind of stakeholders interviews when you first come into, because all of you have actually studied specific cases, specific communities. And I wonder that what is the most challenging part when you are communicating or trying to learn what's going on with with this community. So yeah, so what's the most challenging things when you start to learn about the communities? Yeah, that's my questions.
So it took me a little while to get into the process of staying quiet. There is a tendency when you have done all this research and you have all this knowledge that you want to share it with them. Like, oh, I've studied you. I did your desktop. I've Google stalked you. I know everything. Tell me how your opinions agree with my preconceived knowledge. and learning to go in and hold my tongue. As soon as I'm still hoping I'm getting better, but the more I do that, the more I realize that people continue to want to talk to me. So that was one of the main ones.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I would also say, yeah, knowing the terminology that the community is using and comfortable with. When I first got down there, I realized pretty quickly, it's okay to talk about sea level rise, but maybe not climate change. So just knowing the right terms so people will be open to speak with you. Yeah.
I don't actually have a question. I just want to thank you all for your work on co-producing these thresholds, because I think in the experience that I have, at least, and I wonder if other people have this experience, we can have as many scientific models. We can have years of it. But if those thresholds aren't identified by community members as to when they're willing to switch actions to a different adaptation or consider relocation, then it doesn't land the same way. So I just want to thank all of you for being part of this session to bring that piece together, to say that co-production of understanding risks, understanding thresholds, understanding what makes a place habitable to the people who live there is just so important to this whole conference. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Any last questions?
Wanted to give everybody else a chance first, but Jaimlyn, do you think that your work is scalable and replicable for other communities, or does it require the sort of in-depth scientific expertise that you personally possess? Or is this something that you think other communities could take on given the right tools, data, knowledge? And are there any plans that you have to make this sort of process that you've developed open source replicable for other communities?
Yeah, so my hope is that I will develop a method that can be used by any community that would like to use it, with the addendum that it's not a one hat fits all. There will be some knowledge required, probably a little bit of computer software skills, and certainly social science skills, because the challenges are going to be different for every single community and the needs are going to be different. And I think one of the things I'm trying to accomplish is a method that can be as unique as the communities while providing a standardized workflow that can be adaptable to each of the villages. And once it works and it's vetted and it's great, I am hoping to publish at least a few papers that will be public and should have a very detailed methods. And I don't want to keep it to myself.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to give a big round of applause to the speakers. And this concludes the managed retreat session for today. Thank you.